Okay. All right. Very good. Good morning. Just to get a bit of a view of the audience, how many of you are more in the design part of the work? And how many of you are more in the analysis and architecture part? Some people raise their hands twice. Okay, so it's a mixed audience. Twice is good. So I also try to combine both approaches, let's say, and I will be walking you through a few examples of how we do this at Euroconsumers. I'm an external consultant, working most of my time now at Euroconsumers, where we try to make this happen with respect, as was said in the keynote this morning, for the existing organization, existing people both in operational roles and also in, for example, analysis roles. You cannot just jump in and give these people new methods and hope it will magically work. I will be giving a few examples to show you how we try to approach it. Obviously, there's a lot more experience, both positive and negative, but just to give you a feel on how we try to work it out. Briefly on Euroconsumers. Euroconsumers is a group of 5 different consumer organizations in 5 different countries: Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil. And so that brings a few challenges. It's an established organization. Some of these organizations have been active for over 50 years, so you cannot change things from one day to the other. It also brings 5 different cultures, 5 different ways of politics in the organization. I myself work at project office at group level, so there is distance between group level and local level, which also kind of makes it a challenge to bring change. It's also an opportunity because you have 5 playgrounds to try out things. The business model that we have been working with has been unchanged for the past, say, 50 years, based on strong marketing and trying to sell subscriptions to paper magazines. And it still works. We still have revenue, we're still profitable, so that kind of means that the awareness, that even while there is awareness that some change is needed, that there is some changes on the horizon, there is no high sense of urgency at this moment yet. It depends a bit on the country, but overall, as a group, we're still profitable. Nevertheless, our members, on average, get older each year. So we see that with the digital natives, we don't get subscriptions. People don't want to pay for information on paper when they can get the same information online for free, or at least that's the perception. So in that context, we're trying to make innovation happen without a real strong strategy statement from the future at this moment. The best we get is try to find new disruptive revenue models, which is way too vague to really guide people that are working on ideas and help them in developing new products and services. So in that context, from project office, me as an enterprise architect, we try to help innovation for the people in the company. I will give you a first small example of one of the things that we built or that we create. It's a wine guide. We still produce a lot of things on paper for the fact that our customers like it, but also for fiscal reasons. Paper magazine in Belgium is 6% VAT, digital content only has 21%. So that's a big impact on revenue if we would have to change it to a digital-only system. And so this wine guide contains information about wines, obviously, tasting notes, price, value comparisons, but also a lot of expert information, the chemical composition of the wine, for example. Does it really contain the amount of alcohol that is advertised on the label? Has the wine been chemically altered to make it taste better, even though originally the wine is not that good? Things like that, so real expert information. And then the question pops up, how do we make this valuable? How do we make profit from this in a digital world? Because we cannot simply, well, the idea obviously is to simply create a smartphone app where you can scan a wine and get the information. But how do you make revenue from this? We cannot increase the price of our subscription. It's already high enough. And younger people, there is a lot of competition, different wine apps like Vivino, you probably know. Also a lot of interest in user reviews instead of expert reviews. So the question, how can we compete in a digital world with our expert knowledge, which is kind of a unique selling proposition, is a hard question to answer. But in reality, we need to take a step back and realize that it's the wrong question to ask first. The right question to ask first is, how can we help the consumer with this information? So I guess I'm preaching the choir here when I say that. So, but the first key point of making the change in the organization, helping them innovate, is really starts from the consumer. It's a difficult one because it means a shift in the way people work. The people that create this information, this expert knowledge, need to make the shift from being an expert to being a facilitator, from explaining the consumer what's the best wine to helping the consumer make a choice for the best wine for him. And when we look at the wine app, some user research is a very nice example of what this means. So originally the idea was to create an app with a scan wine button, the button that you see on the bottom. And when we did some user research, users were not interested at all in this functionality. Not at all. Our users wanted to be able to host a dinner party for friends, go to a shop and buy some food, and buy a decent wine in the same shop, not in a different shop, but in the same shop. And it had to be a wine that allowed them to present them to their friends without making a fool of themselves as non-wine experts. So it's a very different context, a very different user behavior than we originally anticipated. But it shows how difficult, how challenging it is, yet also how important to really start from the consumer. Another example is two applications that we have built. A B-cover application, which allows you to check the mobile coverage of your mobile provider and compare it with others, and compare it also with what the provider promises. Do I really get the connection that I pay for? And another one is a complaint service where we let consumers, help consumers make a complaint to a provider. So for example, if your fridge breaks within the warranty period, you can either take it up directly with the manufacturer, or you can file the complaint via Euroconsumers, and we help you with it, we follow it up for you, and we put some more pressure on the manufacturer to make sure that you get that you can get a refund, or that you can get your fridge fixed. And then people start thinking, okay, how can we improve these things? For example, what would happen if we combine them? If we combine both services and we have the B-cover app, and if you see as a user that your coverage is not what it's supposed to be, you have a link to the complaint app and you can file a complaint against the mobile provider. So that's the first thing that popped up when people were trying to think from the consumer point of view. How can we help the consumer in making sure that he gets what he pays for? But obviously, it's not that simple. If I would file a complaint against this big mobile provider, the chances of him changing his network for me is fairly small. So what we do here, and here I give you a first example, well, it means also an important shift in the way people approach their products and services, from commercial thinking to problem-solving thinking, because actually we see that this complaint service is a good new source of revenue. It attracts new members because you build, while solving a complaint, you build a relationship with customers. You can show them the value of being a member. For example, they can use our 50 lawyers to help them process the complaint. So we see it as a good source for new members. And if we really dive into why people propose this new approach, we see that they're actually thinking from a commercial point of view. If we put the B-cover app in front of the complaint service, we attract new people to the complaint service, and we hope to create new members from it. But of course, the real way to start this really starts from consumer, is see how can you solve a consumer problem by combining different services that we have. And so what we do is we create a service model. This is then the business architect coming in. He maps out the different services that we have, but we combine it with, let's say, a design approach by stating for each service what is really the consumer problem that we're trying to solve, the top task or the job to be done. For example, instead of inform consumer about wine, it is help consumer choose wine. Simple changes that really trigger the conversation in the minds of the people that operate these services, in the minds of the product managers. And then we can use this map also as a kind of checklist or opportunity list to show different possibilities. What if we combine not just the B-cover app with the complaint service, But let's try out some other combinations and see what makes sense from the consumer point of view. And then something appears like the combination from bCover app to our telecom service selector, which is an online tool that lets you choose the best mobile provider, taking into account multiple criteria like price, coverage, different options that you have. And this makes much more sense from the consumer point of view, and product managers understand this if you show it. But financially, it's not as interesting because this is a free service, because there's a lot of online competition on it. But still, starting from the consumer means that you create some better loyalty and things like that. So in the long term, this is important. And the service model that we use is a way to do this. And it's part of a bigger model. I will go into a little detail about this later on in the presentation. So you see in the middle the consumer services, which is the service model that I showed, and we have different models beneath it to trigger conversations depending on the context, depending on what we're trying to achieve in our conversation with our product managers, for example. Okay, an example that I will dive a little bit deeper into to show you how we try to combine different techniques is our car insurance selector. It's also a tool, an online tool, to help people choose a new car insurance. And the car insurance market in the countries that we are active in, at least, is a market that is not transparent at all. It's very difficult to compare insurances. There are very big price differences, and you cannot understand as a customer why these price differences happen, and whether it's good for you or not. Do you really get value for money? And so it's a market where we as a consumer organization trying to improve things for the consumer have a very relevant role to play. Yet at the same time, we see that the number of people that use our service selector is declining. And so people started thinking about this, and stakeholders said, okay, we want to improve this car insurance selector. And the first goal taken from the strategy was revenue again. And the solution that they had in mind was to create an updated version of the car insurance selector, and also to add some switch functionality, which allows us to offer people to buy a new insurance on our website by linking it to the provider site, and then we can get some revenue through commission on it. And so, at a first point of view, that may make sense. We improve it to increase our revenue. But then we dug a little deeper and we jumped into the customer journey. A high level, brief exercise. First step, the customer explores possibilities of car insurances and of the fact that it might be interesting to change. He then makes an individual choice. He compares for his specific situation, his type of car, the amount of kilometers that he drives each year and so on. Tries to find out what is the most interesting insurance for him. He makes the purchase, hopefully on our website, and he monitors the situation to see if another change is useful after, for example, 1 year. So that's the consumer journey at a very high level. What we noticed and what we can show to our stakeholders is that it's only in the purchase step that we can create revenue, because the other steps are already covered by online competitors, and we can differentiate from them, but not in such a way that we can ask money for it. So that means that we need to do an investment in the purchase step, in improving that, to get this revenue. And that means that we need to build this. And obviously, if you look at it, this is a problem. Thinking about a keynote yesterday about the hills. These are too many hills. But just mapping this out as a functional architect or an application architect shows the complexity of making happen what business expects to happen, which in their mind originally was a good and simple idea, straightforward idea. So the complexity really is or the required investment really is high to improve the purchase step, but we also did see by doing this exercise that we can easily improve with a low investment the other steps. And so that is the second key point that we try to take, or viewpoint that we try to take. It's know your strength. Know what you are good at from both a system point of view, also from a people point of view, operationally, but also in the market. And that's really important in the market, because when we take this view on our functional architecture, it already looks a bit better. These are the things where we can make a difference. These are the things where people trust us. And by mapping it out and making it visible, you trigger the conversation with your stakeholders to think about, okay, what could be the first step? This is already a small step towards your 3 hills. So know your strengths and see where you can make a change. Another thing about strengths is that we noticed by doing some small user research that the customer behavior is not matching our goals or our initial goal of revenue. Customer is willing to choose an insurance online, but is going to buy the insurance most of the time offline with his broker and not on our website where we can get commission. So combining all these things means that getting that revenue is going to be very hard. And this starts to become a convincing conversation towards the stakeholders by combining both architecture and customer research inputs. What we also see is that actually by doing the investments in the smaller investments in all 4 phases of the journey, we can actually achieve a different strategic goal, which is shake the insurance market. By making sure that people have knowledge in the explore phase about the fact that the insurance market is not transparent, but if they dive into it, they can save a lot of money. We already put some pressure on the insurance market providers. By helping people choose an insurance, we make it even easier for them to make the change. And again, we put some pressure on the market. And this is really our role, an important role for us as a consumer organization. And so it shows how it makes sense to, even though we cannot do an investment, a small investment that helps us get revenue, we can do a small investment that helps us become more relevant in the insurance market as a consumer organization. And then you take some other viewpoints at a more detailed level, like I like to call it enablers. This is really the high-level requirements that a business analyst comes up with, but ideally together with someone that has user or customer experience background or knowledge. For example, how do we make sure that by improving the explore step, we can reach the goal of shaking the car insurance market, making it more transparent, decreasing the prices? Well, we need to be able to reach a large audience. So that means that you need a marketing communication strategy. How do we help? What is important for people to help choose a car insurance? Well, they need to be able to compare not only on price, but also on quality, which happens to be one of the unique selling propositions in the market for us in Belgium. Most online comparison tools only compare on price, but do not do a detailed quality check. What are the special things in the policies of each car insurance provider? So there we can make a difference, and it can help us to, in the end, shake the car insurance market. Obviously, the solution architecture, the application architecture beneath is also important. So you really need to make the view complete in order to have a convincing argument to your stakeholder, both from the inside point of view and the outside point of view, which we try to combine in pictures like this one. And then, of course, we need to see if this is all true, because this is also all nice in theory, but how can we make sure that what we said before, the fact that people are interested in a quality comparison and not only a price comparison, people are interested in a certain market coverage. For example, the number that popped up was 80%. We need to cover 80% of the market in order to be able to help people make a confident choice. But is that really true? How can we find out? So we need to embed learning into the whole process. And this is a real big challenge. From the 3 points, know your strengths really starts from the consumer and embed learning. This is in my experience, in our organization, the hardest part. 2 challenges that I pick out is finding assumptions. What are the assumptions? What do we know for sure? and what do we not know for sure and have to find out in order to make this new product or this improved product a success. And the MVP. What minimum viable product can we create that can be successful? What we did was create a very light approach. I prefer not to call it a process because that's too restrictive. A light approach that guides people into identifying the assumptions and defining the minimum viable product. And it consists of these 3 steps: think, shape, and try. And in the think step, we really help people write down their idea, look at their idea from multiple viewpoints. Instead of saying, we need to build switch functionality in order to create revenue, we force them to look at it from different angles, both internal angles and external angles, to make sure that we really understand what the idea is about. I also refer to the previous keynote about really listening to your to your SMEs. That's really an important point, but we need to help them write down what's in their head. In the shape stage, we try to get some first consumer feedback, qualitative feedback, to help us see how can we describe the problem in the words of the consumer. For example, I once was in a workshop with Gary McGovern, and he explained that while some airlines that offer cheap flights prefer to talk about low fares, the customer says cheap flights, and he will look up cheap flights on Google and not low fares. So you need to make sure that you can explain the problem in the words of the customer. And then you need to start shaping the solution in such a way that the customer says, yes, I really think this solution could help me solve my problem. So that's the shape phase with a focus on getting qualitative consumer feedback. And then the try phase, there you try out things and see if your assumptions are true on a more quantitative, with a more quantitative approach. Now to do this approach, we have created a canvas, and I really like some existing canvases like the business model canvas. But the challenge with that is that in an early stage, it focuses heavily on the organization that is needed, organizational structure that is needed to make something happen, where at the first phase you really want to look with a big focus on the customer. So in that sense, we tried out the lean canvas, but for an established organization, it is missing 2 important pieces. So the focus in this canvas on the top is really on the consumer. What is his problem? What is the journey, the context in which the problem appears? What segment does this problem have? How valuable is it to have this problem solved? But also some existing alternatives. How does the consumer solve the problem today? And I always challenge people that are working on some idea by the question that if you ask your customer, is this problem important for you? And he says yes. And then you ask your customer, how does he solve the problem today? And he says, I don't solve it today, then the problem really is not that important. So this is really, the top half is really about focusing on the customer, helping people that have an idea write it down from the customer point of view. But then for the established organization, the center part, what added value can a consumer organization provide? Does the customer think that we as a consumer organization have a role to play in this, to solve the problem for him? Because you want to have something that is aligned with your brand and your brand strategy and how you are positioned in the market. So that's something to take into account right from the start. And the second thing that is important in our experience in an established organization is at the bottom left, the key enablers and competences. As I said in the beginning, we're going through a shift from being an expert to being a facilitator. And that means, for example, if I take back the car insurance example, we think that it's important to have an 80% market coverage in our insurance selector. That's what we think, but is it really true? The point is that you need to capture this concern and show that you care about it, show that you find it relevant and important. If you leave it off, then you will lose the stakeholders that think this is important. Based on their experience, on the way they have been working for the past 10, 15 years, this is an important point. So you have to make room for it right from the start in order to not to lose them in your product innovation approach. This ID fish also helps us identify the assumptions that we make. So we can walk through them and see, okay, is the problem really relevant? We have described the problem. Let's now measure whether the problem really exists with the consumer. Is the solution valuable? Does the consumer think that the solution is valuable for him? What kind of value does he get? Does he save money? Is something becoming more easy to do or more convenient? Things like that. So we can deduce really assumptions from this ID fish. Should we play a role in it? And for example, in the car insurance example, in that case, it was clear that the consumer said, you can play a role in helping me choose, but you cannot play a role in helping me buy, because that's not what I see fit for a consumer organization. A consumer organization has to be independent, so they cannot be selling insurances. Is it feasible, both from our side and from getting some partners on board? And then the key enablers and competences, but also we look at it from a consumer point of view. For example, the 80% market coverage, that's what we think, but what is relevant is what the consumer thinks. What kind of coverage does the customer need in order to make a confident choice? And it might be 80%, but it might also be, I want to have a view on the top 4 insurance providers and 1 or 2 price breakers. And maybe that's only a coverage of, say, 60%, but it's enough to help the customer make a confident choice. So we keep the question, we keep the concern from our stakeholder, but we turn it into something from the consumer point of view in the exercise. And then the MVP challenge. So you've gathered all these assumptions, and now people are thinking, okay, we need to create an MVP that we can launch. Hopefully it's cheap and quick, but still it's enough to become a success. And this is really in conflict. The minimum is in conflict with the viable and the product. Because if you talk about a viable product, people start drawing out these complex charts, as I showed in the beginning, and it becomes a big project. So the approach we take here is listing all the assumptions and trying to prioritize them. What are the most important assumptions in the sense that they have a big impact on the potential success of our new product or service? And then we start validating these, and we build whatever is needed to make the validation. It can be a survey, it can be a very small mock-up, and slowly you build towards, as you learn, you build towards a product. And the minimum viable product is something that just appears along the way after you have done some validations and you have learned enough about what the customer really values. And sometimes you stop along the way because you see there's no potential, and sometimes you reach almost by accident this minimum viable product level that you can launch officially. The quote that was presented or briefly talked about in the keynote this morning, which I really liked, and indeed this is then the case that you can list all these assumptions, but then you have to bring in the data to make sure that it's actually true, your assumption. And I'll give you one example of how we also try to use our strength in our organization to make this work. We have a call center that is very actively used by our members. We have hundreds of calls each day from people with consumer-related questions or people that are walking through the car insurance selector and that want some help. And so in this call center, we are now thinking about a way to ask these people if they would like to make use of our new approach to car insurance selection, which doesn't exist at all. It's a manual process, but it's a way of us to learn. So we use the call center to gather some input, to do some small surveys, and to see what customers are willing to come on board and help us try out this new service and help us shape this new service. So this is an example of how we try to combine the strengths that we have and use them together to do consumer research. And that should help us make the shift from output to validated outcome. Instead of building something, trying to create that value that you as an organization and that also we as a business architect care about. Obviously, this process is an iterative process, but it's much easier for most people if you give it a 3-stage step. It's easier because it helps people think about it. First we focus on one thing, then on the next, then on the third. So the fact that it's iterative is something that comes up automatically while you're doing workshops and so on. To summarize, I'm going to come back to the enterprise model that I showed you at the beginning, which is how we try to help from an enterprise architecture point of view, help people making this work. And so we have 3 layers in it. The middle layer is what we call the consumer engagement layer, which contains these consumer services and also all the information that we need to capture to be able to perform these services, like the type of car that someone has. But services that have a name starting from the consumer point of view. And really starting from the consumer point of view, so the first part of our approach, we do that by putting the consumer layer on, also inside our enterprise model, which shows the journey, but the journey that is using our services, but also other supplier services, for example, to trigger this kind of question. And then we try to link it to our existing strengths as an organization, our existing operational structure, the fact that we have this expertise about wines, that we have this expertise about quality of car insurances. It's in there. And we try, by using this diagram, to help people make the link between things. Help them see where they fit in, and help them see that if they change something, how it influences or can make use of other things in the enterprise. And so the enterprise model that you see here, with all the details behind it, we haven't gone out of mapping everything, we just create it as we need it. But the model itself is not so much a to-be architecture that we want to create, it's much more a mindset. It helps people think about different aspects of their business and how they fit in and how they can connect with others to make sure that everything works together well. And in that sense, I like to talk about continuous enterprise renovation. We really want to give people the tools and the mindset to help them see how they can play a role in continuously renovating the enterprise instead of building towards a virtual ideal to be in the next 2 years. And the model helps us then really combine these different viewpoints, and this, to conclude, is well summarized by the way that Tom Graves identifies or defines architecture. He says that the aim is to make sure that things work better when they work together on purpose, which is for us as a consumer organization, the purpose of improving life for the customer. Thank you.